AI cannot be conscious. Not now, not ever. Or at least, there's no good reason to think that it can be. In this video, I'll explain why. For anyone who's busy, here's the basic argument in just 2 minutes. We have no good reason to think that AI can be conscious. You might be thinking that consciousness is a bit like software on a computer, resulting from a structure of interactions that we might call structural information. You might think that if we just learn all the structures necessary to create intelligent behaviour like our own, then we can recreate that with silicon, electricity and binary information and we'll create consciousness. But if you think this, you might not recognise the hidden assumption that you've already made, that consciousness is the same as its behaviour. Figuring out mechanisms that can generate intelligent behaviour isn't the same as figuring out mechanisms that can generate consciousness itself. My consciousness isn't my ability to say or do any particular thing. It's my being aware of what I'm saying and doing as I'm saying and doing it. And we have no reason to assume that computer mechanisms that generate intelligent seeming behaviour also generate awareness. The only thing that we can be pretty sure will generate consciousness is the creation of a biological brain like our own. And that's because we know from our own cases that we are conscious and that our different conscious experiences correspond to different neurological brain states. The onus of explanation is on the person who thinks that computational functions can create consciousness. They must explain which mechanism in AI produces not just intelligent seeming behaviour, but also conscious awareness itself. I understand that the opposite might seem intuitive, but I think that's not really surprising. Given we're living in the age of computation, where everything is thought about in terms of data, information, and, well, computation, it's not surprising that many people would make the mistake of thinking that a simulation of neuronal activity, in bits and bytes, could create conscious awareness, but it is a mistake to think so. So that's the basic argument, but if you find yourself recoiling at some of it, I recommend watching the rest of the video as hopefully there'll be some clarification throughout. And at the end of the video, I'm going to run through some specific objections to my argument and why I think they fall flat. Saying that, I'll actually end on one objection that I think doesn't fall flat and does pose a problem for my argument, just perhaps not in the way that you might expect. So the first thing we have to understand is what consciousness is. A lot of people seem to think that consciousness is something mysterious, something that must be so complicated that only really smart people, like the neuroscientists of the future, will be able to understand it. But I think this couldn't be further from the truth. Yes, it might be difficult to understand and map out all the different physical correlates of consciousness in the brain, and it might be difficult to find the most accurate language to describe consciousness objectively, but I don't think any of that means it's difficult to know what consciousness is in itself. In fact, I think each of us knows what consciousness is much better than we know pretty much anything else in the world. That's because consciousness, at the most fundamental level, is no different than your own thinking and experience. You know exactly what it's like to think and experience things, because you're doing it all the time, you're doing it right now. It doesn't matter whether you can explain what causes it or how it works on the level of the brain or neurons. The fact is, you know what your own consciousness is like intimately. Consciousness is the subjective element of experience. It's what the philosopher Thomas Nagel called what it is likeness. As he explains in his 1974 paper, What Is It Like to Be a Bat? Quote, fundamentally, an organism has conscious mental states if and only if there is something that it is like to be that organism. The philosopher David Chalmers describes it in The Conscious Mind as, quote, the subjective quality of experience, which has, quote, qualitative feel. These qualitative feelings are usually referred to by philosophers as qualia. If you're still not quite sure that this defines consciousness, then perhaps broadening things a little will help. Don't think just about your own consciousness, but also that of a child, a baby, or even an animal. A baby's not as intelligent as you or I, it can't do many of the things that AI can do, for instance, but we'd still say it's conscious. So what is it then that is the same about my consciousness, your consciousness, a child's, a baby's, and an animal's consciousness, if not our intelligence? Arguably, the one thing that's still there in all cases, regardless of how much we can or cannot do, is our subjective awareness, our sentience. That's simply what consciousness is, underneath all the rest. And it's that sentience which nobody has been able to give a good reason for AI possessing. Understanding that consciousness is experience is, I think, enough. to take the legs out from under a lot of people's assumptions that AI could be conscious. That's because once you realise this fact, you're also forced to realise there's little reason at all to take the behaviour of AI to be evidence of consciousness. The philosopher Robert Kirk popularised the philosophical zombie thought experiment, which helps demonstrate the distinctness of sentience to physicality and behaviour. It's possible, Kirk claimed back in 1974, for us to imagine a being that is, quote, an organism indistinguishable from a normal human being in all anatomical, behavioural and other observable respects, yet insentient. Zombies, for short. In other words, if you imagine something with exactly the same physical makeup as a human being, down to the atom, but without sentience, i.e. without your subjective awareness, now even if such a being isn't possible in reality, the fact that it's possible conceptually shows that consciousness and physicality, or behaviour, are conceptually distinct. This thought experiment, over time, was used by other philosophers to argue that physical reality alone cannot account for consciousness. But we don't need to go that far here. We can instead use the thought experiment to consider whether behaviour alone can entail or indicate consciousness. Behaviour, that is, such as an artificial intelligence's communications to us. The fact is, even if an AI were to develop to the point where it acted truly human in every way, this would not provide evidence that it is conscious in the sense of sentience. That's because consciousness is not what consciousness does. Consciousness may cause what it does in the physical and observable world, but anything that consciousness does could also be caused by something else, something other than consciousness. In the case of AI, that's the algorithms and electronics that lead to this behaviour. Now, of course, this doesn't rule out the possibility that bits and bytes and their comings and goings through electrical circuits could be conscious, but we'd need another separate reason to assume so, a reason other than its intelligent behaviour. Intelligent behaviour itself gives us not even a fraction of a reason to assume consciousness, because subjective awareness and objective behaviour are two completely conceptually distinct things. Now, in the case of human beings, we have plenty of other reasons to assume that our behaviour stems from genuine consciousness. First and foremost, I believe that other people are conscious because, well, they're like me, and I know that I'm conscious. And the primary way that I know other humans are like me is because I know that they're biological beings, just like myself. They're biological humans, they're made up of exactly the same stuff, and they've developed throughout their lives in pretty similar natural and biological ways to me. I don't have any similar reason to assume consciousness for AI, unless, that is, I'm assuming that consciousness is indicated by intelligent behaviour or function alone. The view that consciousness is simply its behaviour is called behaviourism, and there are more sophisticated offshoots of it, such as functionalism. Functionalism claims that consciousness is defined by the kind of function that it performs. But if we accept that consciousness is defined by subjective awareness, or sentience, as I think we should, then we're not considering whether consciousness is its behaviour, but whether behaviour can indicate consciousness, i.e. subjective awareness. If we thought this were the case, we might use something like the Turing test to detect whether AI is conscious. This test, outlined in 1950, has a human judge compare a machine's communications to a human's, without the judge knowing which is which. If the judge can't reliably tell them apart, the machine is conscious. So the theory goes. But as I've explained, we have no reason to assume this to be true. There's no reason to think that just because something seems to exhibit intelligent behaviour, it also has an inner life and sentience. One illustration that gets this across is the Chinese room thought experiment, presented by the philosopher John Searle in 1980. Searle asks us to consider a person in a room who doesn't read Chinese and is fed, on one side, a bunch of Chinese symbols. They have a rulebook in the room that tells them, in English, what Chinese symbols to feed out to the other side, depending on the ones they're looking at. The rulebook directs them to send out the room coherent Chinese answers to Chinese questions, but the person in the room never understands a single word of it. They're just following the rules in the rulebook. Now, the same could be said of an AI. It outputs data and information based on what it receives, but there's no actual internal understanding of that data and information. In the case of AI, this is incredibly obvious when it hallucinates. Hallucinations are problems with the rulebook. And despite various attempts at rebuttal by different philosophers over the years, I think the intuition behind this thought experiment still holds. It shows that it's possible to have behaviour that mimics understanding without having any actual understanding, and thus behaviour is not indicative of consciousness on its own. Now at this point you might accept that conscious seeming behaviour alone isn't enough to indicate consciousness, but you might still think that if an AI can accurately simulate the kinds of interactions that occur within the brain, that would give us good reason to think that it's conscious. But there are two initial things to note here. The first is that we're talking about a simulation of these interactions between neurons, not actual interactions between neurons. And the second is that we're simulating their interactions, not the neurons themselves. Calling this the same as actual neuron interactions in the brain is a bit like calling a top-down strategy board for a football game the same thing as an actual football match. We might be conveying information about the same kinds of interactions, but the substance or the substrate underlying it, the footballers on the pitch or the neurons inside your brain, they're completely absent. If we're looking at consciousness in this way, then we're considering it a product of structure, the structure of neurons. But if that's how we're thinking about it, why is it only the structure of interactions between neurons that's relevant? Why not the structure of the biological parts that make up the neuron itself? The reason the structure of neuron interactions might seem like the most relevant kind of structure is because this is what gives rise to the functions of consciousness, i.e. intelligent behaviour. That's why we can expect that a computer simulation of a brain will lead to the same objective behaviour as the brain. But notice here that we've returned to thinking about consciousness in the same way that we've already said we don't want to think about it as objective behaviour, rather than sentience or subjective awareness. The only reason we might think a brain-like structure of interactions is what makes something conscious is if we've forgotten that consciousness is not its behaviour. And once we've removed that presupposition, as we did earlier, we have no reason to say that we should stop there if we think it's structure that makes consciousness. Without that presupposition, the decision to stop there is completely arbitrary and needs justification. Why would we not have to go further and also replicate the structure of the neurons themselves, simulating the cell body, the dendrites, the fibres and neurotransmitters? Why would we not have to go deeper than that and replicate the DNA inside the nucleus? Why would we not have to also replicate the metabolism, the cell's constant conversion of nutrients into energy? If we're not assuming that consciousness is its behaviour, we have no reason to assume that any of this is less relevant or important to sentience than neuron interactions. If we just stop at the level of neuron interactions, this is a bit like assuming that we can recreate the moving images on a TV screen by making a screen with little colour filters, but then stopping there before creating the power and the light source and the transistors. We've stopped short of the whole picture, and there's no reason to assume anything less than the whole picture makes what we're looking for. I know that all of this might seem unintuitive, but that I think is just a product of the information age that we live in and how ubiquitous computation is in our everyday life. It's not surprising that we tend to think about consciousness in terms of quantitative data and computation, but is it really so strange to think that biology might be important for consciousness? Is it so strange to think that biological life might be required for sentience? That, to me, seems like a much more sensible hypothesis than that consciousness can simply be created by simulating some interactions that create intelligent behaviour. You say we've designed AI to seem conscious, but we really haven't. You're misunderstanding AI. Even AI developers don't know why AI makes the decisions it does. That's why they call it a black box. To that I would say that just because we haven't programmed AI traditionally, doesn't mean we haven't designed and directed it in the direction of intelligent behaviour. We've trained it on vast amounts of human intelligible data, and through reinforcement learning we've encouraged it to give conscious seeming answers in human languages that we understand. And the fact that it does that learning itself and processes things in terms of tokens, let's say, doesn't change that fact. And I've actually been paid to help train popular large language models by designing rubrics for ideal responses, so I do have some idea of how this is actually done in practice. Still, don't you think it's a bit arrogant to assume you've figured it out and that all these scientists are wrong? Well, first, I'd say it doesn't seem like there's really any consensus within the sciences over whether or not AI can be conscious. And second, why do you think it's within the realm of science, rather than philosophy, to answer such things? Subjective awareness, after all, is beyond the domain of empirical observation and scientific testing. And third, I think arrogance, if it lies anywhere, probably lies with those who think they can create something as genuinely mysterious and fundamental as conscious experience by merely simulating its behaviour with silicon. You haven't really given us an argument for why simulating neuron interactions can't create consciousness, so it's still a possibility and I think it's likely. It's true that I haven't disproven it, but I can't disprove many things that it would be silly to believe in. My only hope is to give people the same kind of realisation that I had about this, once I recognised just how completely distinct consciousness is from conscious seeming behaviour. Once you have that distinction fully clear, the idea that consciousness can be generated by recreating some functional interactions between what are essentially silicon stand-ins for simplified neurons seems frankly ridiculous. So are you telling me that if you were confronted with a silicon-based robot that acted exactly like a human, you'd be fine hitting its power off button? Well, no, of course not. I'd feel resistant to turning it off, because I'm a human being with empathy for other beings that come across as human. That's just how my inbuilt sense of morality is developed. My moral sentiments can't distinguish between actual moral agents like human beings and robots that merely simulate moral agency. And that's exactly why it's important to recognise that AI isn't conscious before we actually develop something so convincing. Because if we don't, well, we're likely to have the wool pulled over our eyes and treat such lifelike AI as actually conscious, and start putting its needs on an equal footing with our own, which could go to our own detriment. Okay, let me change tack. There are plenty of things that we've only ever seen biological beings do that something non-biological could do. For instance, writing a novel, which we could program a machine to do. Why can't consciousness be like this? Well, in the case of getting a machine to write a novel, we could describe in detail how it does so, using only physical and mechanistic language, from the transistor all the way up to the writing on the page or the screen. We can understand and program physical mechanisms that make the novel. The onus, therefore, is on you to explain, in the case of consciousness, what physical mechanism it is that creates sentience, and explain exactly how it can do so. You'd be able to explain how a silicon-based neural network might be able to create intelligent behaviour, but not sentience to go along with that behaviour. But it doesn't seem like any physical mechanism could give us that, no matter which part of the structure of the brain we focus in on. The gulf between the subjective and the physical seems unbridgeable. And now we come to the objection that I think does pose a problem for my argument. And at this point, many will retreat to saying that this means we've gone wrong somewhere, and maybe we should retreat all the way back and deny the notion that sentience is distinct from its behaviour. But I think this would be running away from the gulf that we've discovered between the two, just for the sake of intellectual comfort. Instead, we could do the intellectually honest thing and accept the uncomfortable truth that the gulf is real and must be accounted for. And if we do that, then I think the best answer lies with metaphysical idealism, which says that reality itself is not ultimately physical, but is instead ultimately subjective and experiential. But that's for a future video.